Hi, it's November 16th, 2011. I've tried to improve the lighting a little bit more for this. I've closed the shutters and I've turned on an interior light. This is more from my book, which I hope you can see a little bit better. But don't worry, I will try to do... This is at the request of several viewers, because I don't recommend that you buy my last book. Both editions are unauthorized. I hope you can see that, but I will really make an effort to show you the cover. The Green Candy book has a really ugly green cover. I don't know where my copy is. I don't really want to show you that anyway. And there's only one photo in this book because they didn't use the photos that I had planned. But if you don't get it this time, I'll show it to you in a future clip. La Marquise began to run with an internationally known biker gang. I don't know what the fuck she was trying to prove. Why would she get involved with those people? One of their members, Crazy Pete, came to visit La Marquise often. He was also friends with Annie. Crazy Pete took one look at me and saw his next victim, or girlfriend, same difference. I was in bondage and doing a paid session when he first spied me. He just barged into the dungeon and stood there staring at me. His hair was very long and was bright red. He had a habit of tossing it proudly. I squirmed in my restraints and said hi as calmly as I could to him. He didn't answer for a long time. I don't know what my paying client thought about all this. Are you really a secretary? Crazy Pete finally asked me, tossing back his red hair. Yep, I replied. Cool, he said. Then he walked out. But he came back the next time I worked there. I'd be trying to answer the phones or do sessions, but he'd get in the way, trying to chat me up. He had various proposals. When I indicated I wasn't extremely interested in recreational drug abuse, substance abuse, he started to come up with more wholesome ideas. You're Pennsylvania Dutch, right? Yes, I nodded, a gag in my mouth. He'd barged into another paying session, so he came up with country date ideas. If he wasn't so scary, this would have been kind of romantic, in a very sick way. First, he wanted to buy me a broken-down racehorse and board it out on the beach in Brooklyn so I could be his little cowgirl. I said no. Second, he wanted to take me to a country fair out in New Jersey where there were 4-H competitions. Third, he wanted to drive me into the vague countryside in his huge Thunderbird and just drink beer and commune with nature. To his limited credit, he seemed highly impressed with the fact that I really had a secretarial job and needed to keep basic office hours. He promised to untie me from the roof of his car and get me back to the city each morning to work so I could turn over my small paychecks to him. His best pal in the gang was called Doubting Thomas. I met Doubting Thomas once and couldn't get his face out of my nightmares for the next 5 or 6 years. La Marquise should certainly have known better than to mix with the biker crowd. They provided her with a mighty downfall. While she was sleeping in the back of her loft, the bikers cut the security chain on her elevator, entered, and stole every single item, some of them very costly, from her dungeon. Fortunately, she slept through the whole thing and didn't confront them. I'm sure they would have iced her. She got suddenly smart and wisely hid out in a mental hospital in Manhattan for 2 weeks after they put the whammy on her, then left town, taking only the little sports car and her beloved rotisserie with her. She contacted me a few years later and was on welfare in Texas and had gained a lot of weight, she said. I cut the phone call short and changed my unlisted number the next day. It had been Annie, the lady from East Lansing, who'd set the whole thing up with her biker pals. She was pissed off because La Marquise had decided that at the last minute she didn't want drugs shot up on her premises. Kind of a belated bout of righteousness, if you ask me. I mean, if you've got people shooting up and inviting their biker friends in, don't you think you ought to put a stop to it, say, in the first 6 months of the activities? Call me square. La Marquise fired Annie, and Annie and her friends took revenge. The best personal slave of La Marquise was named Walter. He had inherited 60 grand from his dead parents, and La Marquise seized it from him to set up her dungeon in Gramercy Park. "I want to marry her," Walter confessed to me, crying one night. He really loved her. "Are you sure she's even female?" I asked him. He just cried harder. They lived out in New Jersey most of the time. Walter had a cracker box house in Edison. He did data entry or programming for a computer company, but he was always late to work because La Marquise kept him in bondage while she slept in. He kept getting fired. "Tardiness," he'd mutter. She'd beat him up for getting fired each time, even though he'd been fired because she'd left him suspended in the playroom and taken a sleeping pill, so of course he couldn't be in computer land to punch in on time. I felt really bad when he'd come home very frequently with his final paycheck. La Marquise told him to shut up and run out for groceries. She seemed to always want to celebrate. She was a good cook. She made a lovely pepper steak, and she and I would sit at the kitchen table in the cracker box house and chow down, and poor Walter had his hands cuffed behind his back and a choker collar around his neck. He had his own dog bowl to eat from off the floor. His wine was dumped right on top of the meal for him to slurp up. I don't see how he managed to eat his pepper steak all bent over and colored like that, but he usually did okay. Instead of soy sauce, his meals tended to be salted with his own tears. I felt rotten about it all, but kept quiet. I wish I could find Walter now and tell him I'm sorry, but that would be pretty lame, wouldn't it? Staying with La Marquise was always a gamble. She was never on time, always late. Whether it was driving poor Walter to work or getting me to my secretarial job in Manhattan on weekdays, or even keeping a high-paying session in her dusty dungeon in Gramercy Park. She'd wake up late, groan, take a very long shower using only excellent toiletries, and then grind up fresh coffee beans and force me to sit down and eat Italian pastries we'd bought in Little Italy the night before. I'd go take a shower myself, picking up her wet towel from the floor to reuse. She seldom had fresh ones available, unless Walter had taken out the wash to the laundromat, something he was often reluctant to do, as she generally made him wear handcuffs out in public and kept losing the keys. I'd try to get clean and wash the smell of her artificial cunt off my face. She'd tear open the shower curtain and monitor my use of her beauty products. "Don't use so much of my Vidal Sassoon cream rinse," she'd chide me. A full hour after I was supposed to be at work, we'd get into her little sports car and tool into Manhattan, laughing and flashing our tits to fellow travelers of the road on the way. By this time, my mood was generally improved. The weeping Walter had been dropped off at his computer job, and I was full of fresh coffee, Italian pastries, and a shot or two of fine cognac. La Marquise liked to crash into other cars in the tunnel on the way into Manhattan. When they'd go too slow for her, she'd either rear-end them or else sideswipe them. I've known a lot of New York drivers like this. I don't know what gets into them. My boss was understanding when I'd finally show up to type and answer the phones. There I was, in semen-stained tight black leather, and he pretended to believe my story that we'd been in a car accident in the Holland Tunnel. Nice boss. In fact, my story was partially true. We'd been in a crash, but we had been the ones who'd caused it, and we'd peeled rubber and skidded away guilty. "Just get to work, Lisa," he'd say. He never specified that I be on time, so I kept the job nearly 2 years. After work, there I was, always back at the dusty dungeon in Gramercy Park, answering her phones and trying to book her a last appointment so we could go out and eat in style before everything shut down in Manhattan around 5 a.m. She taught me to love Sweet's restaurant, oldest in New York, in what was at the time an abandoned South Street seaport. She taught me to have cocktails only at Windows on the World, as the food there was lousy, and it was more fun just to have the view while you were getting drunk, she explained. She was right about many things. The food at Sweets was costly but delicious, and a $50 tip got you a table on the right side of Windows on the World. There was a sushi chef to make you little munchies while you sipped champagne and got tired of the view in 6 or 7 minutes. Then it was on to a steakhouse for the beginning of the evening. Dinner was also often at an Italian place near Hester and Mott, and afterward, her favorite place for dessert was an Italian coffee bar just around the corner. She always needed a liqueur after each orgy of food. She is to blame for my bad personal habits now. She drank all day and all night. So did I. I could retire now on all the money I've thrown away on drink over these many years. We stayed in touch for years, but when she finally moved back to her ancestral home in Newport about a decade later, I avoided her. She sensed the snub and never called me again. Where is she today? Did she die of those silicone tits? Did she trust one client too many? And why did I trust her? One night at her slave Walter's place out in New Jersey, we had showered and gone to bed and were having sex. I scrutinized her massive cunt, as usual. Take it, she moaned. I did. I started to lick and slurp it, and it seemed to take 5 minutes to get from the top to the bottom. It was so big. Also, it didn't taste or seem like a real woman's cunt. That is the truth. But I licked it as much as I could and nibbled on her nipples, and next morning she declared, "I'm in love." Uh-oh, I thought. One night, I met her after my secretarial job, and she plopped handcuffs on me and led me to her little sports car. "Weekend in the country," she cried cheerily. As we plunged through the Lincoln Tunnel, I prayed a little. I'm not religious, but it seemed a good idea to pray at that moment in time. We drove to Seabright. A man known as the Corporal had rented a farmhouse and filled it with working kinky whores. He had party weekends, and for about $20 a head, you got let in and got soft drinks, cold cuts, and the run of the place. We brought our own bottle, everyone else had, too. I was wearing a white blouse and peasant dress, with lacing up the bodice. As the guests appraised me, one chanted, "She has such submissive eyes." I prayed La Marquise would protect me from this pack of wolves. To her credit, she did for the most part. "No one plays with my slave unless I say so," she announced. I felt better. I had a vodka and Coke and a ham sandwich. The ham was two or 3 days old and very dry. I chased it with a couple of limp pickles and some heavily sugared coleslaw. We went around the farmhouse and met the other players for the weekend. One, named Anastasia, was in full corset and eyed me hungrily. I feared her mightily. To say she eyed me hungrily surely sounds cliched, but trust me on this one. I was quickly stripped, cuffed, and taken to the playroom, where the evening ceremonies were about to be announced. It must have been a den or study back when the farmhouse was used for normal stuff. The host read us an extremely long list of some rules for the sex play, such as stop when the skin breaks. After he was done reading all the rules, he announced, "Let the games begin." So I'll do another part for you as soon as I can. It's a pretty wild book, but again, I really don't want you to buy it. Both editions are unauthorized, have never been paid, and I never approved the galleys. Okay, that's it. Bye.